A successful businessman unexpectedly crosses paths with his old love at an airport. But when he notices a young man at her side who is a reflection of his youth, he begins to suspect a secret that could change his life forever. What will fate reveal to him this time? The constant hum of conversation, the clatter of suitcases on the shiny floor, and flight announcements filled the air of the airport. Eduardo, a middle-aged man with a serene but somewhat distant expression, sat next to one of the huge windows that offered views of the runway. He was dressed in an impeccable suit, a reflection of his organized and meticulous professional life. In one hand, he held a coffee, while with the other, he absent-mindedly reviewed some documents. Every now and then, he looked up at the crowd, watching faces hurrying past, strangers in transit. It was at one of those moments, amidst the comings and goings of passengers, that a familiar figure made him freeze. His heart skipped a beat. There, a few feet away, was Laura. Although the years had left their mark on her face, Eduardo could not mistake her. Her bearing, her movements, the way she arranged her hair behind her ear were still the same. But what really captured his attention was not only Laura, but the young man who accompanied her. Tall, thin, and with dark hair, the boy had a vibrant energy and a carefree smile. There was something about him that stirred a strange feeling in Eduardo, a mixture of nostalgia and bewilderment. For a moment, Eduardo stood still, watching. His eyes moved from Laura's face to the young man's, and then back again. There was something undeniable about the boy's features. His profile, the shape of his eyebrows, even the way he walked. Everything evoked in Eduardo a younger version of himself. A wave of memories hit him, taking him to a past he thought he had left behind. Eduardo and Laura had been inseparable in their youth, an intense love full of promise that, due to circumstances that now seemed distant, ended up falling apart. Eduardo had moved on, focusing on his career and building a solid life, but he had never completely forgotten Laura, and now fate placed them face to face in an unexpected place and with a question he could not ignore. As the minutes passed, Eduardo struggled between the impulse to approach her and the fear of upsetting an unfamiliar balance. He watched as Laura and the young man talked, the way she placed a hand on the boy's arm with a tenderness that denoted closeness. Who was he? What role did he play in Laura's life? And more importantly, why did he have such an intense feeling of familiarity with this young man? Eduardo took a sip of coffee, trying to calm his nerves. However, he knew he couldn't just stand there, a distant spectator. Something inside him was pushing him to seek answers, even if it meant facing truths he might prefer not to know. He took a deep breath and stood up, leaving the papers and coffee cup on the table. As he took his first steps towards Laura and the young man, Eduardo couldn't help but wonder if this unexpected encounter was a coincidence or something more. Translated from Spanish to English, www.onlinedoctranslator.com. Eduardo walked forward with firm steps, although inside he felt a slight trembling in his hands. As he came closer, he saw Laura turn her head slightly, as if sensing his presence, before actually seeing him. When their gazes finally met, Laura's eyes widened in surprise. For a moment, they both seemed to freeze, caught in a whirlwind of memories that needed no words to manifest. "Laura," said Eduardo with a voice that mixed disbelief and warm familiarity. It took her a few seconds to respond, as if she was processing what she saw before her. Finally, a restrained smile appeared on her lips. "Eduardo, it's been a long time," and she replied, extending a hand that he gently took. The young man at her side looked at them curiously, alternating his gaze between them. Laura seemed to suddenly remember his presence, and with an almost nervous gesture, introduced him. "This is Felipe, my son." The word son echoed in Eduardo's mind, but he kept his composure as he looked at the young man more closely. "Nice to meet you, Felipe." Eduardo extended his hand, which the young man shook with a polite smile. "Likewise," Felipe replied, his voice friendly but without much emotion. There was something in Laura's expression that caught Eduardo's attention, a slight stiffness, a tension that hadn't been there in the old days. He couldn't tell if it was because of the encounter itself or something to do with Felipe, but the feeling persisted. "What are you doing here?" Laura asked, quickly changing the subject as she adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "I'm traveling for work, as usual." "And you?" Eduardo replied, noticing how Felipe looked away at his phone, apparently uninterested in the conversation. "We're just passing through. A little family trip." The answer was brief, almost calculated. The awkward silence that followed was interrupted by the announcement of a nearby flight. Eduardo took the opportunity to lighten the mood. "It's amazing to meet you after so long. I didn't expect to see you here." Laura nodded, but Eduardo noticed that her smile didn't reach her eyes. As they talked, he noticed how Felipe occasionally glanced at him out of the corner of his eye, as if trying to figure something out. The situation seemed to be full of little signs, like pieces of a puzzle he still couldn't put together. "And you, Felipe, what are you doing?" Eduardo asked, turning his attention to the young man. "I'm finishing college, engineering." His answer was direct, but when he mentioned it, Eduardo couldn't help but remember his own youth, when he followed the same academic path. "Engineering, interesting. I studied that too," he said, trying to connect. Felipe raised an eyebrow, as if the comment had surprised him slightly, but he didn't say anything else. Laura, for her part, looked at Eduardo with a mixture of caution and resignation, as if she anticipated what might come next. As the conversation continued, Eduardo couldn't help but feel that there was a deeper story beneath the surface. Laura's vague answers, Felipe's reserved attitude, and above all, that disturbing familiarity in the young man's features. His curiosity grew with every minute, but he knew he couldn't rush into things. For now, he decided to go with the flow of the moment, seeking to keep the conversation light. However, the spark of a larger doubt was already burning inside him, and Eduardo knew he couldn't let it go for long. After the brief conversation with Laura and Felipe, Eduardo excused himself with the promise of meeting them later in the waiting room. He walked to a less crowded area of the airport, looking for a space where he could gather his thoughts. He sat near another window, from where he watched the planes take off and land. But although his eyes were on the horizon, his mind traveled to a past that he believed he had overcome. Laura. Her name echoed inside him like an old, familiar melody. He couldn't help but wonder how it had been possible that, after all these years, her presence still affected him in such a way. He remembered clearly the days of his youth, when he and Laura had dreamed of a future together. They had been inseparable, full of plans and hopes, until circumstances, life, decisions had driven them apart. The Eduardo of those days was an ambitious young man, determined to build a solid career and make his mark on the world. He had loved Laura deeply, but the opportunities that presented themselves demanded sacrifices. Their paths diverged at a time when neither of them seemed willing to give in. And so, with a mixture of sadness and resignation, each went their own way. But now, seeing Felipe, something in her memories stirred even more strongly. The young man's face, his gestures, even the way he slightly bowed his head as he listened, were echoes of her own youth. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected not only the past, but also the decisions not made, the possibilities never explored. Eduardo wondered what had become of Laura's life after their separation. He knew that she had had her own dreams and that, like him, she must have faced challenges to achieve them. But he had never imagined that their paths would cross again, to come across, and even less so in a crowded airport, a young man at his side who raised so many questions. Felipe, the name echoed in his mind, accompanied by a feeling he couldn't quite define. Was it possible that the young man had some connection to him? Or was he letting his imagination run too far? Eduardo tried to dismiss the thought, telling himself that there was no point in speculating without concrete facts. But every time he closed his eyes, Felipe's image appeared more clearly, reminding him of a version of himself he thought he had forgotten. The hustle and bustle of the airport seemed to fade away as Eduardo remained immersed in his thoughts. In his mind, he replayed key moments in his relationship with Laura, searching for signs, clues, something that might make sense of what he was feeling. He knew he couldn't broach the subject directly with her, at least not yet. There was a delicate balance at play, and he didn't want to risk breaking it without certainty. As the sun slowly set behind the clouds, Eduardo felt the weight of unanswered questions begin to take hold of him. He knew that meeting Laura was no coincidence, and that, one way or another, he would need to confront the past in order to understand the present. Eduardo returned to the boarding area, his heart still racing from the thoughts that had accompanied him during the last few minutes. He found Laura and Felipe sitting in a quiet corner, she leafing through a magazine, and he absorbed in his phone. Eduardo sat down near them, trying to act naturally, although the questions that were boiling in his mind made it difficult for him to remain calm. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said with a kind smile, looking at both of them. Laura looked up and gave him a slightly tense smile, while Felipe simply nodded politely before turning his attention back to his phone screen. Eduardo noticed that the young man seemed a bit reserved, almost as if the previous conversation had left him with an uneasiness that he was not willing to express. "So, how has the trip been so far?" Eduardo asked, breaking the silence that was beginning to become awkward. "Relax, nothing out of the ordinary," Laura replied, closing the magazine and letting her eyes rest briefly on Felipe. There was something in her tone that seemed deliberately neutral, as if she were trying to keep the conversation superficial. Eduardo decided to change his approach, knowing that he had to be subtle if he wanted to obtain any information without raising suspicion. "Felipe, you mentioned earlier that you are studying engineering. What area interests you?" The young man looked up, surprised by the direct question. "Renewable energy. I have always been interested in how to improve things with technology," he replied, this time with a little more enthusiasm. Eduardo smiled, genuinely impressed. "It's a fascinating field. I was involved in something similar when I was younger. I guess it runs in the family, don't you think?" The sentence hung in the air, and Eduardo watched as Laura tensed slightly. It was a small gesture, but it was telling. She crossed her arms and looked away at the crowd, as if searching for something to focus on to avoid answering. "Well, sometimes affinities are not so easily explained." Laura intervened with a smile that seemed more like an attempt to divert attention than a sincere answer. Eduardo sensed Laura's discomfort, but he didn't let that stop him. He decided to approach the subject even more indirectly, looking for clues in the conversation. "What about your family, Laura?" he asked casually. "I was always curious to know how your life went on after we stopped seeing each other." Laura looked at him with a mixture of surprise and caution. It was clear that the question struck a nerve. "I've had a quiet life. Felipe and I have supported each other. I think that's the most important thing, isn't it?" He replied with an air of closure, as if he wanted to avoid going into more depth. Eduardo nodded, respecting the boundary Laura seemed to be setting, but internally his curiosity only grew. He couldn't ignore the feeling that Laura was hiding something, and every evasion reinforced his determination to find out what it was. Felipe, who was not in the conversation, returned to his phone, but Eduardo noticed that his gestures were less relaxed. As if, like Laura, the young man also felt the tension floating in the air. As time ticked by and the announcement of flights continued to fill the air, Eduardo made a silent decision. He would find a way to get to the bottom of this, even if he had to wait for the right moment. After that tense conversation, Eduardo tried hard to keep up appearances. He knew that pressing further at that moment would only make Laura close herself off even more. However, the seed of suspicion had been planted, and every little detail he observed in Felipe fed his doubts. As the minutes passed, he couldn't take his eyes off the young man, analyzing his gestures, his way of speaking, even his sporadic laughter, which surprisingly reminded him of his own. At one point, Felipe got up to go to a nearby vending machine. Laura, who had been trying to keep the conversation light, let out a barely perceptible sigh as her son walked away. Eduardo took the brief opportunity to test his waters. "He seems like a nice boy," she said casually, although her eyes were fixed on Laura, searching for some reaction on her face. "It is," she replied quickly, without looking up from her bag, where she was pretending to search for something. There was a brief silence before Eduardo continued. "It's funny. There's something about his personality that seems familiar to me." Laura paused, her hand still on the clasp of her bag. Eduardo needed no further confirmation. That small gesture spoke more to him than any words. Before he could say anything else, Laura turned to him, her expression trying to be firm, but failing to hide a flash of discomfort. "Eduardo, I don't know what you're implying, but I think this is not the time to talk about things from the past." Her answer was clear enough for Eduardo to understand that it was not a topic she was willing to address openly. However, her vague and defensive response only fueled his suspicions further. He decided not to press the issue, at least for the moment. When Felipe returned with a can of soda, Eduardo watched him even more closely. There was something about the way the young man carried himself, with that mix of confidence and nonchalance, that evoked an almost exact reflection of how he used to be at his age. But what really disarmed him was a casual comment Felipe made as he sat back down. "I was thinking, Mom, do you remember that time when you mentioned that when I was little, people told me that I looked a lot like someone from your past?" said Felipe as he opened his can. The air seemed to freeze. Laura glanced quickly at her son, who was distracted with his drink, and then looked at Eduardo, clearly nervous. "Felipe, this is not the time to remember unimportant things," Laura responded, her tone firm but hurried. However, Felipe's comment had already had its effect. Eduardo felt his heart pounding as he tried to maintain a neutral expression. The young man's seemingly innocent statement seemed to confirm what his instinct had been telling him all along. There was a connection, a bond that he couldn't yet define with certainty, but which was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. While Felipe was busy with his phone and Laura looked away toward the window, Eduardo decided that he couldn't stay in doubt for much longer. It was clear that Laura was hiding something, and sooner or later, he would need to confront her directly. But for now, he would keep his suspicions to himself, watching and waiting for the right moment to act. The bustle of the airport seemed to die down as Eduardo walked towards Laura. It had been a few hours since their last tense conversation, but he couldn't ignore the questions that plagued him any longer. He found Laura alone, sitting near a cafe, her expression absent as she stirred a cup of tea. It was time. They needed to talk without Felipe present. "Can I sit down?" Eduardo asked softly, trying not to sound confrontational. Laura looked up in surprise but nodded without saying a word. Her face reflected a mixture of tiredness and resignation, as if she knew this conversation was inevitable. "Laura, I don't want to pressure you, but I need to understand what's going on. There's something that doesn't add up, and I think you know it too." She put the spoon down on the plate with a clang and sighed deeply. "Eduardo, there are things that are difficult to explain. Things that I made decisions to leave in the past," she said, avoiding looking directly at him. "Is Felipe my son?" Eduardo asked suddenly, his voice low but full of emotion. Laura looked up quickly, her eyes shining with a mixture of surprise, guilt, and some pain. For a few seconds, she seemed to debate whether to deny it or confirm it. Finally, she let out a shaky breath. "Yes, Felipe is your son." Time seemed to stand still. Eduardo felt a wave of contradictory emotions, relief at having obtained the truth, sadness at the lost years, and above all, a deep sense of bewilderment. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked in a small voice. "When we broke up, I wasn't sure how to handle it. You were so focused on your career, on building your life, and I was afraid of complicating everything," Laura replied, her voice filled with regret. Eduardo clenched his fists, not in a gesture of rage, but as a way to contain the avalanche of emotions that were overwhelming him. "But you had no right to decide that for me, Laura. I deserved to know. Felipe deserved to know." "I know." Laura looked down, her eyes fixed on the teacup. "But at that moment, I thought I was doing the right thing." There was a long silence between them, broken only by the distant murmurs of the airport speakers. Eduardo tried to process everything, the revelation, the implications, and most of all, how this would change his relationship with Felipe. "Does he know?" she finally asked. Laura shook her head. "I always tried to protect him. I didn't want him to grow up resenting you for not being there. I thought it was better that way." Eduardo looked at her in disbelief. "Protect him from what? From his father?" "Laura, I would never have abandoned my son." The words hung in the air, and Laura seemed to shrink a little under the weight of her guilt. "What do you plan to do now?" he finally asked in a tone of resignation. Eduardo took a deep breath, his gaze firmer now. "I'm going to talk to Felipe. I can't get back the years I lost, but I can try to build something with him from now on." Laura nodded, though her expression was a mix of fear and hope. "Just be careful, Eduardo. Felipe is a good boy, but this will be a blow to him." Eduardo knew it, but he also knew there was no turning back. The time had come to face the truth and build a bridge to the future. With a heavy but determined heart, Eduardo sought out Felipe. He found him in an airport rest area, sitting alone on a bench, headphones on, and his attention fixed on the screen of his phone. The young man had a calm expression, oblivious to the emotional storm brewing. Eduardo approached slowly, trying to find the right words. He knew that this conversation could change everything. When he reached Felipe, he cleared his throat softly to get his attention. "Can I sit down?" he asked with a smile that sought to convey calm. Felipe took off one of his headphones and nodded, shifting his things around a bit to make room. "Sure, go ahead." There was a brief silence as Eduardo searched for a way to begin. He decided to go with honesty. "Felipe, I wanted to take this moment to get to know you better. I know we haven't talked much, but I feel like there's something special about this meeting." Felipe looked at him, curious, although clearly puzzled by Eduardo's serious tone. "Well, I'm not usually very good at talking about myself," he said with a shy smile. "Don't worry, I just want to hear from you. For example, what was your childhood like? Have you always lived here?" Felipe shrugged, relaxing a little. "Sort of. My mom and I have moved a couple of times, but we've always been together. She was always very independent. I think that taught me a lot." Felipe's words made Eduardo feel a pang of emotion. There was so much of Laura in him, but he also sensed reflections of himself in every gesture and pause. "And your dad?" Eduardo asked, trying to keep a casual tone, even though he knew the question was key. Felipe looked at him, clearly surprised by the turn of the conversation. "I don't know him. Mom never talked much about him. She always said he was an important person, but things didn't work out." Eduardo nodded slowly, feeling a mixture of sadness and guilt. Felipe's words echoed everything Laura had explained to him. "Have you never been curious?" Eduardo insisted, looking him straight in the eyes. "Of course I did, but I learned to live without thinking too much about it. Although," Felipe hesitated for a moment before continuing, "I always wondered if I would ever meet him." Eduardo took a deep breath. The time had come to tell the truth, even though each word weighed like a mountain. "Felipe, I think it's important for you to know something. Something your mom and I talked about today." The young man raised an eyebrow, now fully attentive. "What thing?" Eduardo swallowed and leaned forward slightly, trying to make his words clear and sincere. "Felipe, I am your father." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Felipe stared at him, as if trying to process the information. His expression went from shock to disbelief, and finally to a mix of confusion and conflicting emotions. Why didn't Mom ever tell me anything? It's something she thought was best at the time, but I assure you that if she had known about you, she would never have been far away." Felipe looked away, clearly overwhelmed. Eduardo respected his silence, giving him the time he needed to process what he had just heard. "This is a lot," Felipe finally murmured. "I know, and I don't expect you to accept it right away. I just want you to know that I'm here, ready to start over, if you want me to, too." Felipe didn't respond immediately, but Eduardo could see in his eyes that the young man was struggling to find clarity in the midst of the whirlwind. The silence that followed Eduardo's revelation was almost deafening. Felipe remained motionless, staring at the ground as if searching for answers in the airport tiles. Eduardo, although anxious, respected the space the young man needed, watching as his son processed a truth that altered the foundation of everything he had known. Finally, Felipe broke the silence, his voice shaky but firm. "How could I not have known this before? Why did Mom keep something so important from me?" Eduardo took a deep breath, wanting to handle his words carefully. "She thought she was protecting you. She feared that this truth might complicate your life, or mine, in ways she couldn't foresee." Felipe looked up, his expression a mix of disbelief and pain. "Protect me? From what? All my life I've had questions, voids, and now it turns out that the answer was there, but no one bothered to tell me." Eduardo felt the intensity of his son's words. He understood his frustration, because he too felt a void from the years they had lost. "You have every right to feel that way, Felipe, but please don't think it was easy for her. Laura did what she thought was best at the time." Felipe shook his head, his mind clearly filled with conflicting thoughts. "I don't know what to think. Her voice cracked slightly. I always imagined my dad would be far away, not interested in me, and now you show up here as if nothing happened. It wasn't like anything, Felipe. If I had known about you before, I would have been here from the beginning, but I was never given that opportunity. The sincerity in Eduardo's voice made Felipe look at him directly for the first time since the revelation. There was doubt in the young man's eyes, but also a spark of interest, as if he were searching for something deeper, something that would confirm that Eduardo spoke from the heart. Why did you decide to tell me now? Philip asked after a moment, his tone more moderate. Because you deserve it. You deserve to know who you are, and I deserve to know you. I know it's a lot to take in, but I'm here now, and I don't plan on walking away. Felipe nodded slowly, as if trying to accept the weight of those words. However, confusion was still evident on his face. I don't know if I can process this right now. Everything I've believed in, everything I've known about my life, it feels like a lie. I don't want to pressure you, Eduardo said calmly, but I want you to know that I'm willing to answer all your questions whenever you are ready. Felipe looked down again, taking a long breath. This is going to change a lot of things, right? Only if you want them to change, Eduardo replied. The sincerity of those words seemed to resonate deeply with Felipe, who finally stood up from the bench, his expression tense but determined. I need some time. I don't know what to feel, but I don't want to ignore this either. Eduardo nodded, knowing he couldn't ask for more at the moment. Take all the time you need, Felipe. I'll be here when you're ready. Felipe nodded slightly before walking away a little, leaving Eduardo alone. Although the moment had been difficult, Eduardo felt a ray of hope. He had planted the seed of a truth that, in time, could blossom into a genuine relationship between father and son. Time seemed to stretch after the initial conversation between Eduardo and Felipe. Both gave each other space, although thoughts of what had happened were constantly with them. Felipe had sought refuge in a quiet corner of the airport, where he could try to sort out his mind. Eduardo, for his part, remained close, not wanting to invade, but willing to talk if his son allowed it. Finally, it was Felipe who made the first move. He approached Eduardo with a serious expression, but not as rigid as before. There was something else in his gaze, perhaps a small openness, a desire to understand more. Can I sit down? She asked, mirroring the same words Eduardo had used earlier. Eduardo nodded, grateful for the gesture. Of course. There was a moment of silence between them, but it wasn't awkward. It seemed to be a necessary pause, as if they were both gauging the waters before continuing. Finally, Felipe spoke. I don't know where to start. There are so many things I want to ask, but I also feel like I don't know what I want to know. Eduardo offered him an understanding smile. There's no rush. We can go at your pace. I'm here to answer whatever you need, no matter how long it takes. Felipe nodded, visibly relieved by the words. What were you like when you were my age? He asked with a hint of curiosity that broke the emotional barrier a little. Eduardo took a moment before answering. Ambitious, impatient, full of ideas and plans. I thought I could conquer the world if I worked hard enough. I guess that attitude helped me get to where I am, but it also made me miss important things along the way. Felipe stared at him, as if trying to imagine Eduardo in his youth. Eduardo took a deep breath, wanting to handle his words carefully. She thought she was protecting you. She feared that this truth might complicate your life, or mine, in ways she couldn't foresee. Felipe looked up, his expression a mix of disbelief and pain. Protect me? From what? All my life I've had questions, voids, and now it turns out that the answer was there, but no one bothered to tell me. Eduardo felt the intensity of his son's words. He understood his frustration because he too felt a void from the years they had lost. You have every right to feel that way, Felipe, but please don't think it was easy for her. Laura did what she thought was best at the time. Felipe shook his head, his mind clearly filled with conflicting thoughts. I don't know what to think. Her voice cracked slightly. I always imagined my dad would be far away, not interested in me, and now you show up here as if nothing happened. It wasn't like anything, Felipe. If I had known about you before, I would have been here from the beginning, but I was never given that opportunity. The sincerity in Eduardo's voice made Felipe look at him directly for the first time since the revelation. There was doubt in the young man's eyes, but also a spark of interest, as if he were searching for something deeper, something that would confirm that Eduardo spoke from the heart. "Why did you decide to tell me now?" Philip asked after a moment, his tone more moderate. "Because you deserve it. You deserve to know who you are, and I deserve to know you. I know it's a lot to take in, but I'm here now, and I don't plan on walking away." Felipe nodded slowly, as if trying to accept the weight of those words. However, confusion was still evident on his face. "I don't know if I can process this right now. Everything I've believed in, everything I've known about my life, it feels like a lie." "I don't want to pressure you," Eduardo said calmly, "but I want you to know that I am willing to answer all your questions whenever you are ready." Felipe looked down again, taking a long breath. "This is going to change a lot of things, right?" "Only if you want them to change," Eduardo replied. The sincerity of those words seemed to resonate deeply with Felipe, who finally stood up from the bench, his expression tense but determined. "I need some time. I don't know what to feel, but I don't want to ignore this either." Eduardo nodded, knowing he couldn't ask for more at the moment. "Take all the time you need, Felipe. I'll be here when you're ready." Felipe nodded slightly before walking away a little, leaving Eduardo alone. Although the moment had been difficult, Eduardo felt a ray of hope. He had planted the seed of a truth that, in time, could blossom into a genuine relationship between father and son. Time seemed to stretch after the initial conversation between Eduardo and Felipe. Both gave each other space, although thoughts of what had happened were constantly with them. Felipe had, "Like Mom?" he asked cautiously. Eduardo nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting a mixture of melancholy and gratitude. "Yes, like your mom. She was the love of my life, but I made decisions that drove us apart. I never knew she had such an important reason for contacting me later. If I had known, things would have been different. Felipe, this is a change for everyone, but if you think it's the right thing to do, I know Eduardo is willing to do it right this time." Felipe looked at her gratefully before turning his attention back to Eduardo. "I'll give you my number. We can keep in touch, but give me some time to adjust to all this." "Sure," Eduardo responded quickly, almost relieved. "Time is something I'm willing to give you, as long as we can build something together." They exchanged numbers, a small but symbolic gesture, sealing the promise of a shared future. Laura watched them in silence, her emotions mixed. It was obvious she was worried about what this new bond might mean for Felipe, but also seemed relieved to see that there was a chance for reconciliation. When their flight was finally announced, Laura approached Eduardo. "Thank you for being patient," he said quietly, his tone honest. "I know this hasn't been easy for any of us, but I want to believe it was the right thing to do." Eduardo nodded, grateful for her words. "It's never too late to fix things, and no matter how hard it is, I'm willing to do it." Laura gave him one last look before turning to Felipe, who was watching them from a few steps ahead. "Well, it's time to go," Laura said, getting her son's attention. Felipe looked at Eduardo once more before shaking his hand, which soon turned into a brief but meaningful hug. "See you, Eduardo," said Felipe in a tone that revealed a mixture of respect and curiosity for what was to come. "See you later, Felipe," Eduardo replied, feeling that this simple exchange meant more than he could express in words. As he watched them walk away toward the gate, Eduardo felt a mixture of nostalgia and hope. Although the past could not be changed, the future now offered possibilities he had never imagined. With renewed determination, Eduardo left the airport. He knew the road would not be easy, but he was ready to take it. After all, he had found something more valuable than any professional success: a second chance to build a meaningful relationship with his son. The story of Eduardo and Felipe reminds us that, although the past cannot be changed, there is always time to rebuild broken ties and create new memories. Sometimes the decisions we make thinking they are the best can leave deep wounds in others, but honesty and the effort to heal can always open new doors. Would you have had the courage to face such an unexpected truth? Click on the video on screen to continue this exciting journey of self-discovery and learning about the importance of family relationships. If you haven't already, Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more inspiring stories like this one. See you in the next video.